Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this session. My name's Ruth Larby. I work at UE, and I am going to be the host for this session, which is called Partnerships on a Landscape Scale. So today we're going to be having a really interesting discussion about how to do partnerships on a landscape scale. We're going to be talking about nature-based solutions, and we're going to be talking about how we can get outside of our little box, our patch, to kind of overcome some of the challenges around borders and boundaries in creating partnerships on a landscape scale. So joining me today, we've got two panel members, two speakers. We've got Vibs Bhatia, who, welcome Vibs, who is actually founder of South Asians for Sustainability, which launched in January, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. And she's in the process of setting it up as a CIC, but the organisation is about raising awareness and engaging South Asian communities on climate emergency issues, kind of sustainable living issues, and carbon conscious behaviour as well. But I believe you don't only work across cultural and linguistic borders, but also with businesses as well, because you've been sustainable business coordinator at Dixon's, and you're going to be taking up another consultancy role soon. So that's Vibs. And we've also got Mike Moorcroft. Welcome, Mike, who is Principal Specialist for Climate Change at Natural England, who also is an ecologist and has been working also on the next IPCC report, which I believe may be coming out in early next year. Is that right, Mike? So I'll let our speakers introduce themselves a bit more when they start their presentations, and they can tell you a bit more about what they've been working on. But just to let you know what it's going to look like in this session, we're going to have a bit of a time for presentations from both Vibs and Mike. And then we're going to be going through some kind of in-conversation questions where I'll pose some of the questions that I have about their work, and see how both of their reflections can bring forth some insight on these areas. And then we're going to have time for some audience questions at the end as well. So I'd like to encourage everybody to post your questions as we go along in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session. Great. Okay, so can I ask you to kick off, Mike, with your presentation?
Yeah, happy to do that. And yes, it's lovely to be with you all. And yeah, it should be a really good, interesting time we have together. Right, I'm going to share a few slides. So here we go. Okay, hopefully we can see that. Can we, Ruth? I'm going to assume we can.
Yeah, sorry. Can see that. Yeah, I muted myself.
Brilliant. Okay, so nature-based solutions for climate change at the landscape scale, we'll add in there, but for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I just want to, I suppose, introduce the topic by thinking about what we actually mean by that. So the kind of, I suppose, the most widely used definition of a nature-based solution is one that came from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And it goes something like this: nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Now there's a lot of words in that, but if we unpack it, it is about solutions, it's about solving problems. So it's not about just generically doing good stuff, it's solving problems, but doing it in a way that benefits both people and biodiversity. And I think those are the key elements to hold in your mind. And when we talk about climate change, that's got a very broad remit, really. There's the concept of climate change mitigation, which is all about reducing emissions and taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, stopping climate change or anthropogenic climate change. So that's things like you can see on the left-hand side of these few images I've got at the bottom, things like planting trees to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, or restoring peat bogs to stop them emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So that's the mitigation side. But climate change is already with us. We already have a degree or so of warming globally and in the UK. So we have to cope with the consequences of that. And things like restoring salt marshes, which is, I suppose, the third sort of picture postcard going along the bottom there, is good for storing carbon, but it also helps to buffer the coastline against the effects of a rising sea level. And when you lay in storm surges on top of that rising sea level, the impacts can be much greater. And by providing coastal habitats, you get a buffer. And that's an aspect of climate change adaptation. Another one is providing shade in a city. It's a way of cooling a city, making it more livable in a hotter climate. And that's another aspect of adaptation that benefits us as well as nature. So it's urban, it's rural, it's on the coast, it's inland, and it's climate change mitigation, and it's climate change adaptation. But what does that look like in reality? So I'm going to ask you to imagine you're stepping outside for a moment. This is a place not too far where I live, on the far western border of Berkshire, almost into Wiltshire. Well, actually also into Hampshire, which is where this was taken, looking at the landscape there. And as soon as you look at it, you don't just see, a grassland or a wood. It's a whole patchwork. It's almost an archetype of the English landscape. We've got little patches of semi-natural habitat and interspersed with agriculture and with a whole range of other different land uses. So that landscape scale really matters. What do we do in the right place? We can't plant trees everywhere, or we won't have anywhere to grow food. Sounds a bit of a stupid thing to say, but it's more subtle than that, because we don't want to take the land where we can go on sustainably and productively delivering food and put it into growing trees if we possibly can. And then what about all the people who own the land? What do they want to do with it? If you're the farmer of some of the land there, what do you want to do? How can you keep your business running? And then there's all the people who live and work and walk and enjoy the countryside here. They all have a voice as well. So you've sort of got multiple aspects here of working at a landscape scale. There may be many different landowners and even more users of the land to take into account. And that's on top of those sort of basic biophysical questions about doing the right thing in the right place. A similar issue if we go to a more upland area, and this is Rowdsey Bog, Rowdsey Moss in South Cumbria, looking towards the Lake District Fells. And this is a peatland. Peatlands are our biggest store of carbon, and yet often they're in poor condition, and as a result of that, they're releasing it to the atmosphere because of past drainage and over-exploitation. So actually, to restore Rowdsey Moss, trees were removed from that bog. So planting trees is a good thing in some places for climate change, but where it's the wrong tree in the wrong place, like planting it on a peatland, actually we need to reverse it. So again, you get into a whole sort of question in the upland landscape of what do you do where? Where's a good place for trees? Where's a good place for open moorland? Where's a good place for hill farming? And where can our bogs thrive? So we've got to think big. We've got to think across the landscape, physical, geographical landscapes, but also the landscape of human use that's reflected there. And I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to Vibs.
Thanks very much, Mike. Go for it,
Hi,
Vibs.
everybody. Thanks, Ruth. First of all, I'd just like to thank the organisers, the panellists, and everybody here today. It's really great to be here and to be talking on this topic. I am Vibs Bhatia, the founder of South Asians for Sustainability, as Ruth mentioned earlier on. And I'm just going to be talking a bit about my journey so far in working in the sustainability area. So I studied psychology at university and worked on some climate change modules, which really pivoted me towards this area and focus for my career. Coming from a social sciences background, but not necessarily environmental, it was quite a challenge to kind of enter the sector. So worked with a lot of grassroots organisations in the Midlands. And a lot of that included tree conservation work, planting trees with various organizations, a few plastic kind of single-use plastic campaigns. And then I moved on to business sustainability, where I have worked for the last 2.5 years at Dixon's Carphone from a really kind of CSR business angle and sustainable business, looking at how we can change our business model and adapt to climate change as a business and organization. And South Asians for Sustainability really came about this time last year for me. I think a lot of us had some more time on our hands with the pandemic, and it really occurred to me as a South Asian woman in this space professionally that there was a gap really on a community level within the professional area. I really seeked a community that represented me culturally, but also professionally as well, and where I could share experiences and knowledge and have some level of mentorship. But when I searched for that space, there wasn't really anything. And I guess that's where South Asians for Sustainability came about. I took it on myself to kind of start networking, putting out feelers and understanding what people are doing in this space. And today, really pleasantly surprised and grateful that I've connected with over 100 different South Asian people working in various industries and really learning from their experiences. So I guess the key aims of South Asians for Sustainability, we focus on spotlighting people's work within the sector, whether it's environmental related, whether it's social impact and community related. And our key kind of focus is to show that sustainability is culturally relevant, whether it's in South Asia, in the global South, or in the UK and further in the global north and the west. And really showing how to bring about sustainable actions and climate action in a culturally relevant way. So that's kind of an overview of where we're at right now. Kind of steps ahead, we're looking to create some resource packs that we can communicate to the community that we're building on the platform that host sustainable actions and change on a culturally kind of relevant platform. So whether it's we focus in on events or community hubs or various organizations within the UK and beyond that are practicing a lot of nature-based solutions and volunteering, how they can have the right information that is academically supported, and how they can intertwine that within festivals and cultural events that are really important to South Asian communities. So yeah, I guess that is a brief overview of what we're trying to achieve, and a bit about me as well. And I'm really excited to get stuck into this topic and engage with you all as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Vibs. Thanks both of you for those overviews. It's really interesting work that you're both kind of really interesting questions that you're both thinking about in both of your different areas of work. So we'll try and kind of pull some of those together and see what we can come up with as well. So I just wanted to kick off our kind of discussion with a question about what does the term nature-based solution mean to you? I know, Mike, you've gone into this a little bit in your presentation, but I'm trying to really get to what we as environmental communicators, can we use something as a shorthand? Would it make sense to everybody? Those kind of questions. So would either of you like to start on that?
I can go ahead. So for me personally, from a business perspective, often I guess nature-based solutions are looked at as what Mike had touched on, tree planting, and kind of, you know, maybe some offsetting or something that's relevant to the business strategy. If, for example, it's a food-based business looking at agriculture and how to restore that kind of space. But often in a lot of businesses, I guess now as well, when you know, there's a lot more focus on nature-based solutions, sometimes it can just become a bit of a cop out sometimes, I think, nature-based solutions, and when they're not well informed, it can kind of look, especially on a communication level, a bit dodgy, to say the least. And I think that's where greenwashing comes in a lot. But personally, for me, when I look at nature-based solutions, I think of how it goes hand in hand with communities and the values of those communities. Whether it's a small village or a town or a large city, how is creating, say, a green wall in a main city landscape going to help that local community and the resources that they require? Is it actually doing that versus in a rural area, as Mike had touched on, marshland, if you planted a tree there, it would be negative. So kind of weighing up what is needed in what place and how that impacts community, how it goes hand in hand, and keeping that balance. I guess for me, that is what I would see and deem as a nature-based solution, looking at both the community and the environment.
I think for me, the thing I draw people's attention to when looking at that IUCN definition that I put up is that it's the biodiversity and people and nature, and it's not one or the other. It's both, and it's not just using nature to benefit people. There needs to be some kind of benefit to nature as well. And I suppose, you know, somewhere below that, there's a deeper sense of actually seeing ourselves as part of a much wider natural system. We are part of the ecosystem. Where, you know, our very lives depend on it. You know, the molecules of our body were growing in a field once. You know, so it's trying to understand that connection that comes at a deeper level there. And I think, you know, we have to be honest. Sometimes the word nature-based solution is used in a bit of an unfortunate way, you know, to just mean sort of exploiting nature to try and get us out of the problem we've created. And sometimes, if I'm honest, you know, there is an element of greenwashing about it as well. So I think it's a term that needs to be carefully discussed and thought about, and not just used as shorthand for something that we think we know what we mean. I think it's a useful concept, but as a shortcut in discussions, it can be risky because different people do sometimes mean different things by it.
Great, yeah, I think that's seems to be a key challenge in both areas in a way. So I just wanted to ask a follow-up, really, to see how, if every tree that could be planted cannot be called a nature-based solution, in the example of peatlands, I'm very glad you put up a picture of the Lake District. That's where I'm from, so thanks for the call out. If every tree that could be planted could not be called a nature-based solution, then how can we deal with people who might have good intentions at tree planting, for example, but where the outcome may not be a solution, or it may have undesirable outcomes?
Shall I follow up with that, as I sort of perhaps started us down that line? So I think, first of all, there's a need for information. There is a need to talk, and it's a bit of a cliche telling communication experts and enthusiasts that we ought to talk more, because if ever there was preaching to the converted, that would be an example. But it's true, it does need a discussion. And I have to say, underneath it, we do probably need some underpinning of regulation as well. And this is an emerging field, especially as we get into potentially trading carbon in nature-based solutions. There will need to be a strong regulatory basis for that. I don't think we're there yet. These things, unfortunately, do take a time to work out, and there's a risk of bad regulation as well. So yeah, I think I'd like to keep on the positives of more information, better science, filling some of the evidence gaps we still have, and talking together. But underpinning that, there does have to be regulation, and probably quite soon down the line here. There is some already, so you're not actually supposed to plant on peatlands. It does still happen, but there is some regulation there.
Just to add to that from kind of a business angle, as I touched on slightly earlier, I think it really depends on the business strategy and aligning with the nature of a business. So for example, at Dixon's, I am it's my last day actually today. I'm moving on to a more onto a consultancy role at EY. But from what my experience has been there, as a tech kind of orientated company and a retailer, it doesn't necessarily, it's not the first thing that makes sense to our business strategy to introduce nature-based solutions. There's no direct link, specifically because we are not taking from the land directly in what we do. We're not an agricultural related business. We don't sell food, for example. And so I think ultimately that within businesses, it's looking at aligning with the business strategy and making sure that it makes sense to gain the kind of input and the commitment really from throughout the business to implementing a nature-based solution. We've had a lot, say our Newark is our distribution center. We have areas there where our own colleagues are very active in enhancing biodiversity. They've got a little green garden and they plant things themselves, and that's something that they love doing, and they're utilizing that space really well. But from a business angle, we look at other solutions such as recycling and circular economies, which make more sense for our climate actions in what we do and where our impact can be largest. And then from a kind of like a cultural and religious organization aspect within South Asian communities in the UK, one kind of I've spoken to various charities who do tree plant on a regular basis, and I think a key point to again reiterate Mike's point is about education. So they may have volunteers, and a fundamental part of a lot of religious kind of volunteer groups, whether it's in Sikhism, Hinduism, within South Asian communities, selfless service is a huge part, and so they see nature-based solutions as a way, planting trees, for example, or doing street cleanups as their service. But if they don't have the right information, if they're not networking with the right trusts, woodland trusts, where they can know exactly where is the right place to plant trees, I think that's where unintended consequences can come about. So it's engaging with those communities, and ultimately, from my perspective and experience, it's about having representation there to connect with those organizations and community members and leaders, to educate them on the right path and connect them up with the right organizations. But I'm sure we'll go into that in more depth in the rest of the conversation.
That's great. Thanks. You wrote very interesting insights there, both of you. So I know there's some questions that have popped up in the chat, but I'm going to ask my next question, and hopefully it'll touch on some of the themes in those questions as well. So I wanted to get more into this kind of partnerships element, and ask whether you've got any tips for us as an audience of environmental communicators about how we can cross these borders that we're talking about. And that may be between the different people you referenced in your presentation, Mike, the kind of landowners, the policy people, the regulatory people, or it might be cross-culturally or cross-linguistically, or cross-business and community spheres for you, Vibs. How we can cross those borders and get out of our patch to work at a different scale or across multiple scales.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, once we start talking about borders and scale, I mean, I think it's worth saying that there are many different geographies here, and we come up against, you know, that sometimes the human geography, you know, political boundaries between different council areas, you know, development or not, don't actually match up with some of the fundamental physical geography boundaries on the ground. So, you know, soil and climate determine ecosystems as well as a history of management by people. And, you know, in terms of managing water, for example, which is a crucial element of this, you know, catchment boundaries are pretty much fixed by the underlying topography, you know, and they don't pay that much attention to whether, you know, it's this council or that council, or you know, what ethnic background of the people who live there, you know. And I think sometimes we also need to align ourselves a bit better with some of that kind of natural world reality that we try and ignore, you know, and taking us into a sort of related area, you know, things like building in floodplains, for example, is perhaps an example of that, you know. But in terms of that sort of reaching out, I mean, you know, it's a cliche to say it, but it's so true. You know, you have to listen to people and engage with them as well. And you know, many of my best colleagues in Natural England are those who work at a very local level, who know their patch very well, who spend time talking with people. And you know, if you are talking to a farmer who's, you know, perhaps been on the land in that place for, well, in some cases for generations, but certainly, you know, it's often an older community. You know, they're very well established, very rooted. They've got their own customs and practices, and that's going to be quite different to you know, a sort of I don't know, a school group, for example, want to plant some trees in a city. You know, and partly it is about knowing your patch, I think, and the different people within it, and that we should never sort of dismiss that. I think, you know, the people who actually work, I work nationally and internationally, but actually people who work in a place and get to know it really matter here, and it's bringing together that sort of perspective. But then, yeah, I think it's about talking, it's about engaging with people, and I suppose trying to ultimately build a shared sense that this is, we're all in this together. You know, it has to be done at scale if it's going to really work. You know, a few trees here and there isn't going to cut it. Likewise with peat bogs, you know. So we do all have to, you know, understand we share the same planet, you know, and I think, you know, better discussion, more communication, I think is really at the heart of that.
Just to add to that as well, I think it makes some great points on engagement, and I guess how do we actually engage communities that are as diverse as we have in the UK. And I've found language tends to be a huge barrier, as does terminology and jargon. And sometimes when we talk about these nature-based solutions or anything related to the climate emergency and beyond within mainstream media and otherwise, we kind of cut off large parts of our communities because they don't necessarily understand what that exactly means, or why they should care, why it's relevant to them. And so in order to build that sense of this is our earth, this is where we're all here together, we're all you know, we all need to champion this. I think ultimately it comes down to meeting people on a relevant, like a relatable in that kind of place. So for example, if we were to look at global south communities, whether in South Asia, beyond, or and those communities that have migrated to the UK, a lot of their families and communities back home will be in agriculture. Farming is huge, particularly within South Asia. There's garment workers in Bangladesh, for example. So when we look at different sectors, it's finding that relatable piece of that community, what they can see, the kind of climate events that they can relate to happening in countries they associate with, and bringing that sense of this is my issue as well. I feel that's really key, and language. So I touched on terminology. One of a close friend of mine carried out climate adaptation research in Punjab in northern India, and found that farmers there actually referred to climate change effects as weather change, and that simple word and change of phrase meant the world of difference to the people there, and maybe their families over here too, because as they're conversing across borders, they may refer to, oh, you know, that there was there's a huge dry season, or we've had great flooding, but they've not necessarily made that link to what they're hearing in the media here and what they're hearing in the news stories here. So I think that's really key, is understanding from those communities what they refer to and what they see on a day-to-day, and then that relatability can be built over time.
Great, thank you both. So I guess in both ways, I picked up on in both of your responses, kind of knowing your patch, knowing the landscape of what you're dealing with, and as environmental communicators, kind of knowing those communities, getting to know those areas is really important. So just wanted to ask, when we're working across all of these different domains, so we're looking at biodiversity, we're looking at climate change science, we're looking at the kind of the hydrogeochemistry, the water and the soil, we're looking at the cultural, the social, other human geographical elements, and then we've got political, kind of infrastructural elements. When we're working across all of this, maybe it's inevitable that we come across some trade-offs, I suppose. It can't go the way of everybody's intentions all of the time. So I wonder whether you could just talk us through maybe some of your experiences with such trade-offs, or how you might, whether you've got any insights on how we can deal with those constructively in our work.
Mike, did you want to kick off?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, there is only a fixed area of land, so you know, the way we have to try and use each bit the best we can, and different land will support different things. But there is no getting away from the fact that there is a pressure here, and using land to address climate change is exacerbating that already quite considerable pressure in a densely populated place like Britain. The one I think that worries me most at the moment is around bioenergy, growing crops for energy, some of which might be used for what's called bioenergy carbon capture and storage, where you burn vegetation material in order to produce fuel, but then you also, in the course of the burning, you capture that carbon and store it, which is a big part of most of the scenarios for actually tackling climate change. But it could become extremely land hungry, and we will have some of it, but we've got to work really hard, I think, to make sure that it doesn't take more land than absolutely necessary away from food production or for protecting nature. It must be done in a way that doesn't compromise water supply and environmental quality in other ways, including, of course, biodiversity. So, there are good and bad ways of doing it, but at scale, it adds to the pressure. And I think there's a sort of trickle back there to all the other things we have to do to tackle climate change, to reduce fossil fuel use, to insulate our homes better, to use more truly renewable energy in the sense of wind and solar, and improving battery technology, and it all starts to join up. So that's the one I particularly struggle with at the moment. On a more sort of type specific thing, I work with forest industry from time well, fairly regularly actually, and they will say, well, lovely to have native broadleaf tree species, but I need the sawmill to take it in order to do something useful with it. So there are a whole series of market things here. If you grow timber but you can't sell it, if you're trying to make a business from wood products, you're up the creek, aren't you? So I think there are some trade-offs there, but I do think there are ways through. I think there are synergies that can be found. I think there are ways of developing markets for wood products from native broadleaves, but it's going to require work. Does that help?
Definitely, I think so. And the work and the kind of pace is something that we need to be having the conversation about as well, I suppose. Vibs, do you have any further comments?
Conscious of time, I want to get in everybody's questions as well. But just to quickly add on to that, I guess from my experiences from a business level, but also community aspect, the trade-off kind of stands out more so from what I've found speaking to various people of color from Global South and those communities here as well. So thinking about migration and the what they migrated to this part of the world for was a greater quality of life, greater quality of living and standards as well. And so when we talk about nature-based solutions or anything just in terms of sustainability, sometimes it can switch people off straight away because they assume automatically, if they're not aware and educated, they assume that means almost like a step back, or that because Global South communities are inherently sustainable and their practices have been through ancestry, they sometimes can question, but why should we go back to what we used to do when we've come for this life with more convenience and better ease and quality of living? And so that is sometimes a trade-off that I have come across, that you have to kind of educate and communicate in a way that it's like, no, you're not giving up on anything, you're not stepping back, you're not going back on what you came here to progress on, but this is why it's important to engage with this, because XYZ has happened in these parts of the world which will be relevant to them. They can see their families have or communities have faced those impacts, and then they can relate to, oh, okay. And then I've seen the light bulb kind of switch in those moments when you explain it through that frame, rather than them putting them in a situation where they may feel that they're not being able to progress, because who are we to say that they can't, right? Who are we to say that there should be this north-south divide, that it should just be everybody should have equal opportunity, but it's how we encourage and how we empower those communities, I feel. So yeah, that's just a brief overview from me, but keen to speak to everybody for questions as well.
Really interesting. Thank you very much, both of you. I just wanted to kind of pick up on something there, which was about this kind of finding the positives, or finding the links with progress, or finding the synergies in what both of you have been saying. And just encourage people who are listening, if you've got any good examples of synergies that are happening in this area, please do post them, and we'll kind of, so everybody can see. But I wanted to pick up on a few of these questions. I'm not sure we'll have time to get through all of them, but one of them stands out. It was something that I was thinking of as well while you were talking, which is, do you find that the term nature-based solutions is well understood by the communities that you're talking to, or do you find yourself having to explain it so that it can be understood, and so that it connects? So is it a fit for purpose term, basically?
I personally feel it's not fit for purpose. I feel there is explanation that's required, because if you were to translate nature-based solution, it doesn't necessarily mean what we define as nature-based solution. And so if you were to just plainly say, it's this initiative, it's tree planting or a green wall, like more directly, I feel communities, especially if English isn't their first language, you know, that it's much easier to just plainly state exactly what that solution entails, rather than having a key terminology to umbrella everything, and then hopefully with more engagement they will grow to understand a bit more about the subject and topic, and they will then is a point to use nature-based solutions. But I think in the first instance, when communicating, it's always better to just plainly state. That's what I've found. Keeping it simple, it really opens up the understanding of wider populations and communities. Mike, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I think it can be useful, and it presses the right buttons with some, but not all policymakers at the moment. But you've got to be careful, and I think if a more specific term is appropriate, use that. You know, if you mean tree planting, say tree planting. I think also, you know, sometimes it just does require a little bit more expand. Yeah. I think we've lost Ruth, which is rather
Hello.
unfortunate. Are you there, Ruth?
Can you hear me again?
Yep, can hear
Great.
Well, you and I are still here, Vips.
you.
So,
I can definitely.
shall we carry on?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go for it.
I can hear Ruth.
Okay, fab. We're slightly delayed, I think. Just wanted to thank everybody for their comments as well, because we've got some really interesting examples in here. But we've got another question about what are the new models of partnership working? And I wonder whether you had any thoughts on any models or kind of mental models that we could use when we're talking about partnership working.
Can you still hear Ruth, Vips?
Yeah, I can hear her. The question that was raised was about models of partnership. Any key examples of partnerships that are working? I think you may know more, Mike, than me.
Okay. Yeah, I hope people can hear me, but if you can hear me, then that's a good sign. And,
Yeah, can hear you.
So partnerships that are working. Well, I'm very interested in this because I am actually setting up a new partnership project, which is actually called Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Change at the Landscape Scale, where we're working with colleagues across some of the public sector organisations, but also want to establish partnerships with 2 local pilot study areas to look at this more. I think if you look at sort of history of nature conservation in Britain for the last few decades, you can see there has been a bit of a trend towards establishing these local area-based partnerships. And I can think of things like the nature improvement areas going back a few years. And at the moment, there's been a rush of new applications for things like the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And they're almost all partnerships where you've got local area people working together. In terms of what works, I think some of it is just the chemistry of the individuals involved. I don't think we should underestimate that. I think it's often good to, you know, actually have the public and the private and the third sector working together. I think there are strengths in the different approaches. And you know, having that sort of diversity of engagement there, I think is good. I think also, though, it's fair to say a lot of this takes time, and actually starting from scratch is that much harder than building on something you already have. So I don't know what your experience is, if you can add anything to that, Vibs.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with that. I think a lot of partnerships that are, you know, going to be long lasting and have the most impact take time to build, and it takes a lot of education and awareness raising and building up a community and group of people who are passionate and understand the best way forward for nature-based solutions. So I think in the urgency of everything, sometimes that can be forgotten, that things do take time, and we don't have the answers to everything within partnership models either. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at all try and continue with work and engagement.
Great, thank you both. I'm aware we don't have time to address everybody's great comments, but I just want to thank everybody for posting in the chat and for listening to this session. Some really interesting comments.
I still can't hear Ruth, but I think we've probably come to the end of our time.
Well,
yeah, she's just closing off.
Thank you.
We're just wrapping up now. Sorry you couldn't hear me, Mike. Really interesting comments about cost effectiveness and evidence and data and collaboration. But I just wanted to thank our speakers, Mike and Vibs. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all. And I hope you have a lovely communicate and enjoy the rest of the sessions. So thanks very much.
Thank you.